You may also like. A show about the things you may also like. Things like...
Stuart, how did you ever get into politics?
Well, you know, it's interesting. In 1983, at that time, Joe Clark was the prime minister, and I was the leader of the PC Party of Canada. And I had just been involved in the music business, and I started to, in Ontario, I started to do some volunteer work for Bill Davis. And part of that, Matt, was really looking at, you know, when a politician comes into a room, I kind of looked at it from a rock and roll perspective and said, why don't we sort of jam the music like up and get this crowd going and make it work? So I started doing some volunteer stuff with Bill Davis in Ontario. And then, of course, Brian Mulroney came along in 83 and became the new leader of the PC Party of Canada. And during the election campaign of 1984, I spent a fair bit of time on the road with him as a volunteer, just kind of setting up events for him. And the classic story on this thing, Matt, is that the last day of the election campaign, we're doing this massive rally in London, Ontario at the airport, thousands of people out. And at the end of it, he is flying to his home base in Baie-Comeau for election night in 1984. And if you wouldn't know, he looks around and turns to me in front of all these people and says, I'm going to give you a call. And I thought, this guy is so good, like in front of all these people, right? Sure enough, about 2 weeks later, after he won in a massive majority in September of 84, he called me and said, look, would you come and run my tour office and organize all my trips and travel with me and all that stuff? And so I did. So that was I did that from 84 to 88, Matt. And I guess it's one of those things with the passing of Mulroney last week. It's just become very evident that I was very blessed to, frankly, be in places that a lot of people never will ever get to. And it was an honor to work with him.
It's a pretty wild time. So were you at the Ottawa Civic Centre in 1983 when he won the leadership?
I was not. And so through the Bill Davis piece is how I started to get introduced to the Mulroney piece. And but yeah, that was some pretty crazy stuff, as all those conventions were. But that was before cell phones. I mean, people had walkie-talkies. And were you there?
No, I watched it on TV,
Yeah.
but I was living in Ottawa at the time. I mean, there's another story to the whole thing. I think the year after, Trudeau passed me on his walk in the snow. I happened to be outside, and he passed me and said hello, but I didn't know that he was thinking about resigning at the time, which eventually led to the election of Mulroney. But I remember 83. I remember all the buzz and activity that was going along. I think there was about 8 or 9 people who were running for the leadership of the party, and it was going to come down to Clark and Mulroney. But what about the election campaign of 84? Were you a part of that in any particular way?
Yeah, in a big way. And so, you know, that was really where I got a chance to understand that when you set up an event, I mean, it's like setting up a mini rock show, right? I mean, you've got a stage, you've got a backdrop, you've got lights, you have to have media spaces for the traveling media, and then, of course, the massive public, as many people as you can get out. And, of course, the old adage, Matt, was you always book a room that is way too small for the crowd that you're expecting so that they can spill out onto the street. And that was where I got a chance to watch Brian in action and got a sense really that there was a big change happening in Canada. Didn't know the numbers at that time, of course, but it proved out that he won a massive election on September of 84.
So now that we're all looking back at that, somebody did mention that was really the last time that Conservatives had any form of true relationship inside Quebec. Is that true?
Yeah, I think that is very true. I mean, I think that that was one of Mulroney's, you know, when he was out on the stump. And I think when he said, this is the reason you need me to be the leader, and this is the reason you need, as a Canadian, you need me to be the prime minister, is I will bring Quebec into the progressive conservative family. And he did that in a big way. And I think that really sort of changed the face of Canada. Of course, you know, we can project forward, Matt, to things like his Meech Lake and some of the things where he tried to bring Quebec into Confederation, which unfortunately at the end of the day was not successful. But yes, he very much was the first guy to really sort of open Quebec up for the Progressive Conservative Party of Canada.
Was that the promise? Get in bed with some of the sort of soft nationalists, and in our time, we will bring Quebec into the Constitution, and he just couldn't capitalize and make it happen in the end?
Yeah, I think that was very much the hope and the intent. I mean, I think he was seen as a homeboy Quebecer. I mean, not that Trudeau wasn't, for sure, but I think that that was kind of where he wanted to go. And he saw this incredible, Trudeau was amazing to bring the Constitution here to have it signed in Parliament, but he was short one major province, being Quebec, and Mulroney looked at that and said, leave it to me. I know how to negotiate. I know these folks. I have to get to be prime minister, but once I get to be prime minister, let me bring this country together from coast to coast to coast.
And invariably, what happened on the other side, there was a couple of unpopular decisions that happened that alienated the West. I think back to some airplane contracts in Winnipeg in around late 80s, early 90s, and also Preston Manning going off to start the Reform Party because just generally being disgruntled with the type of conservatism that was happening. So was that partially a result of trying to work with Quebec, or was it just a different form of conservatism? Or how did the Western alienation come about?
Yeah, I can say that that I'm not sure that I can give the definitive answer on that, Matt, but I will say this, that when you look at what was happening in Western Canada, I mean, first and foremost, Don Mazankowski from Alberta was the deputy prime minister, and Mulroney leaned on him a lot. And so you have the second most powerful person from Western Canada, and then you start loading up all of the cabinet ministers that we hear from the West. I think anytime you make a decision, you're going to help. I mean, I remember Mulroney always used to say, as prime minister, I get a chance to appoint the postmaster of some small town in Manitoba. I make one person happy and I upset, 500. So, I think when you make decisions, and clearly I think the CF-18 contract and the CF-5 contract that would really polarized what happened between Manitoba and Quebec. This is a bit of a rabbit hole for a second, Matt, but financially, it was a much better contract to get the CF5 Bristol contract here in Winnipeg in Manitoba than it was the 18, but it was the fact that it went on and on and on, and then it appeared as if Manitoba became a second cousin. And in politics, when things don't go well, if somebody's sharp on the other side, and Preston Manning was obviously a very, he's an intelligent guy, and I have my love affair and hate affair with Preston Manning. He was an intelligent guy, but that's where the West wants in. And one thing that happens, and you see it down across the border, MAGNA, what does that mean? Make America great again. Well, for some people, a slogan like the West wants in, people start looking at it and saying, yeah, we do. They don't necessarily understand what it means, but you can kind of grab onto it, and certainly was very successful for Preston Manning.
He did some things, whether it was in the first term or in the second term, and not everyone was a fan of free trade, and he got reelected based on that, on his work getting free trade with the United States and Mexico. I remember an early clip, J'ai voté pour toi, et après ça, c'est Bye Bye Charlie Brown.
Yes.
The Bye Bye Charlie Brown clip that ran on French media. The GST was not popular everywhere. It replaced the manufacturer's tax, but essentially it was a consumer's tax. Doing unpopular things, there were some unpopular things that were good for Canada, but he withstood them.
Yeah, and I would say, Matt, that just if you step back for a moment, I think when you look at where we are today and you look at politics today, I mean, it's social media, it's 140 characters. I mean, I do think that a good, fair question to ask all leaders of all political parties is, where has the big thinking gone? Like, where has the risk-taking gone? And, I mean, one thing about Brian, he was never afraid to take a risk. I mean, he took some, and when he didn't succeed, like Meech Lake, he was crushed. But, that didn't stop him from trying to make a big decision or have a vision for a country that he felt was worthwhile. And you look at the free trade agreement, that 1988 election was really a free trade election. And I can tell you, when I traveled with him on the bus, the election bus, I mean, there were times like in Kingston, Ontario, that we had to bring in I guess it would be the OPP on horses, because there were people, they were rocking the bus and they were against it. And I mean, it really polarized people, but it got people engaged. And I'll make two comments on it, Matt. Number one is, I think, and I could be wrong and I stand to be corrected, but I believe that voter turnout for that 88 election was one of the highest we've ever seen in Canada, which showed that people got engaged. Whether they voted against or for, I mean, they got engaged. But the second thing is, and I think that this is a lesson for a lot of political leaders, is that, in 84, Mulroney mopped the stage with Turner. I mean, it was, you had a choice, sir, you could have done better. So that changed things amazingly. In 88, it was a different debate because Mulroney had 4 years of governing. Turner was on the other side and sort of pointed some things out and was very negative on free trade. And the debate didn't go quite the way we wanted it. And I know that there were some meetings afterwards, and there's a lot of political, there's some great political advertising where, the Liberals would show a map of North America and they would show a big eraser rubbing out the line between Canada and the United States, saying that that's what's going to happen. They're going to take us over. And we came back with a big red line and drew it back in and said, that's not accurate. It's not the way it's going to be. My point simply, Matt, is that there was a lot of concern that maybe the tide was turning against the Prime Minister at that time around free trade. And there were meetings that happened at the very highest level where people said, you know what, Brian, why don't you take free trade out of the discussion and say, look, if we win, we'll have a referendum on free trade. So let's talk about something else. If we win, it'll happen. And he literally stared everybody down in the room and said, do you understand? I am running on free trade. That is my referendum. That's what this election's about. And so he stared everybody down. And really what my takeaway from it was that those politicians that feel like, David Cameron over in the U.S., or even to some extent, we had a referendum on taking down barricades here. Referendums never go the way that a leader would like them to go. So my takeaway from that is anybody who wants to be a political leader, referendums, put them on the shelf, run on what you believe on, and, live or die by it.
Boy, I forgot how good that Liberal ad was about taking out the line. And right. I'll put that one right up next to, again, another referendum in 95 where the Lucien Bouchard and the Parizeau Yes campaign used the loonie, the Canadian loonie, to spell out the word we, as if we're going to be using the Canadian dollar. So, we're going to be a little bit half pregnant with the sovereignty thing. Yeah. And as the Charlottetown Accord goes down, it's 9 years. He's tremendously unpopular at the end, even though I want to also talk about some other great conservative things that did happen in that time, including acid rain. Totally. It became the party of the environment. And as well, I think there was an introduction to gun control as well, the latter of which the Liberals began to really move forward afterwards. But how come those have been sort of taken away into the Liberal? Those are things we associate with Liberals now.
Well, Matt, I'll just correct you on one. Gun control, potentially, yes. But, Brian has been acknowledged by all of the environmental organizations as the greenest prime minister in Canada. I mean, that is on record. That's a fact. And that has a lot of that to do with what he did with Reagan and Bush 41. At that time was the vice president, wasn't 41 president, but Bush was the vice president, and it was all around, the treaty on acid rain. And I think that having an opportunity, I remember distinctly that we were at a G7 summit in Bonn, Germany. And I know that Mulroney was trying to get ready to talk about acid rain. And Reagan came out and went to the washroom. And I was standing outside the room. And Mulroney came out in a shot. And he looked at me. He said, "Where'd he go?" And I said, "Well, he's in the washroom." So Brian followed him in. And I can tell you that during that moment, they started a conversation about how do we start, from a Canadian perspective, engage the Americans on acid rain. And of course, the culmination was Bush vice president coming up to Ottawa, and some conversations that obviously led it to fruition. But, those are kinds of some of the things that from time to time you see, and you realize there's a story to be told there. So it was a fascinating moment for me personally.
He had a lot of deeply personal relationships with a lot of powerful people. Good friends with Lucien Bouchard till he wasn't.
Right.
George Bush, attending family functions together, weddings and whatnot. A lot of deeply personal relationships.
Yeah. And, Matt, I think on that score, I think when you look at Brian and his legacy, and those that don't like him, they might as well just tune out right now. It won't change them. But for anybody that wants to look at this guy and just try and judge some of the things that he did, he loved, as you say, deep relationships. He worked hard to have a great relationship with both Reagan and Thatcher. He wanted to be part of that club. But, on apartheid, he parted company with Margaret Thatcher. but he didn't do it in a malicious way. He didn't do it in a way that caused all sorts of media stories and cycles. He basically took a stand. He talked to Thatcher. He knew that she was going to disagree, but he knew that he'd be on the right side of history because of his relationship and his understanding of apartheid. And so, history would show that Mandela then came to Canada and was very, very thankful for what Brian Mulroney did. But the other one you talk about in terms of personal relationships is when Reagan wanted to bring in this whole thing called Star Wars that was going to sit up in the sky and protect everybody from what might come from enemy fire from across the way. And again, Mulroney knew that Star Wars was not something that Canadians would embrace. But again, what he did was, I think, one of the things that made him such a great leader is he took a moment, he called Reagan and said, look, President Reagan, I got to tell you, we cannot stand with you on this, but we're not going to attack you on it. We're simply going to say that we can't stand with you. And so I think to this day, Matt, some of those relationships that he forged were because he did it in a principled way.
At the end, again, not terribly popular. The party was not terribly popular, but I thought, and I wondered in 30 years, would we be sending our kids to Brian Mulroney Elementary? Would there be an airport named after him? Not terribly revered, but in passing, we all look back and go, yeah, we remember the good times.
Well, I mean, you have to look at the battle that he went through in the good GST, that people looked at that and said, this was, I think, one of even his own caucus members called it the gouge and Scrooge tax. And, what all Mulroney was trying to do from a business perspective was to take a hidden tax and make it very visible. Now,
it's simply a consumer tax.
That's exactly right. And at some point, Matt, that was the simple message. But, I mean, you look at free trade. I mean, I remember talking to some of my friends when Mulroney was talking about free trade, and people were saying, you know what, I love it. I think it's going to be fantastic. I'm not sure what it is, but, every time I come across the border, I always lie about what I have, so I don't have to lie anymore because we got free trade. And it was like, well, hang on for a second. That's not exactly the intent of this. But, that today, I mean, you look at how free trade has built this economy in Canada, and it's due to obviously free trade and then NAFTA as it went on. But, that was Mulroney looking at it and saying, if you're making a widget in Baie-Comeau, do I want to sell it to 20 million Canadians or 200 million in the States? Why won't we send it to 200 million in the States? And I think history will show that was a very big decision to make. And I think it speaks volumes about his vision and his capability.
What did he do post 1993?
Well, I think there was always, of course, the history will show there was the issue that with Karl-Heinz Schreiber. I mean, I think he dealt with that, and I think following that, I mean, the fact of life, Matt, is that where Brian may have had some challenges in Canada, he was, and maybe I'm using too strong of a word when I say revered, but he was very, very well liked outside of Canada. I mean, major boards wanted him on their board for one reason. He knew people, he was connected. He understood how the global economy worked. And so he put himself, I think, in some really good positions, advising and working with Bush 41 and Bush 43. I think he also opened himself up to people like Stephen Harper, or he opened himself up to people like Justin Trudeau when he was working with Trump on the renegotiating the U.S. trade agreement. And of course, he wrote a book, which I think most politicians do. They want their story to be out, and he did that, I think, pretty effectively. But I think, Matt, I think what he did very consciously, and I think he spent a bit of time kind of figuring it out, but again, this I think goes to the intelligence of Mulroney, is he recreated himself. And so when you think about the past number of years, when Brian Mulroney was on CBC National or on CTV National, or, if he were to come on your podcast, he would speak as an honest, open, committed, true statesman about this country of Canada and how we need to move it forward. I saw a piece the other day that Hugh Segal had written something about we should look at having sort of a level of income for those people in Canada that don't have a certain level of income. And so Mulroney was talking about how we should explore that. And I think the comment was made, can you imagine any Conservative Prime Minister having that conversation today? So I think he looked at what the challenges were of being a Prime Minister of a very complicated country And I think he basically wanted to say, if I can help somebody from my experience, call me. I'll help as best as I can.
And you've been a conservative leader yourself. So what impact did he have on you and your aspirations of being a leader and becoming one?
Yeah, so Matt, and I always say again, I this isn't to rile people up, but this is really just to be factual. I was the leader of the Progressive Conservative Party. I've always felt that, progressive on social issues, conservative on fiscal issues was a great place to be. I believe it in my bones today. But yeah, I put my hat forward to be the progressive conservative leader in the province of Manitoba after Gary Filmon was defeated by Gary Doer, and it was a great experience. Didn't end how I wanted it. I jokingly today, because Gary Doer and I mean, it's one of the things you make friends, and I've always joked with him afterwards, and I said, Doer, I trained you for 7 years to be the ambassador to the United States, and so you owe me big time. Of course, that's completely tongue-in-cheek, but I can say, Matt, that this is a great province we have in Manitoba. Being the leader of a party, you get a chance to go to every nook, cranny, corner, every party, every kitchen, every sod turning, every whatever it is throughout the province. And you get a chance to see it up close and personal with real people. And that was a great experience for me. I've always said I think I could go to any town in the province of Manitoba and go in and have a coffee with somebody and I'd be invited in. And I think that's because they just want to talk to people that they think they can help. And I got involved in politics like most people do because you want to make life better for people. As I say, it didn't work out the way I wanted, but it's an experience that I feel really good about.
You touched on it earlier, and that was Brian Mulroney's approach towards South Africa and apartheid. And you yourself now have been working in human rights. How'd you get started in human rights?
Yeah, Matt.
Human rights advocacy.
Yeah. Thanks very much. So, I was the inaugural CEO of the Canadian Museum for Human Rights that started here in Winnipeg. I mean, when it started, it way before me. I mean, Gail Asper, Izzy Asper, the Asper family. But we broke ground in 2009, and I was a part of that to oversee the actual construction and then the working of the content inside the building to sort of how we would use it from an educational tool. A building, it was amazingly gorgeous. Little sidebar, Matt, by the way, the architect, Antoine Predock, just passed away. I think yesterday or today. I just got a note on that. So that's a tragedy. He was an artistic genius. That building is pretty spectacular. But I got a chance to be the president and CEO of the Canadian Museum for Human Rights. Matt, I'm not a human rights expert, never will be, but I was fortunate enough to be surrounded by a lot of people who were. And so I learned a tremendous amount from them and their passion and their commitment. And when I left the Canadian Museum for Human Rights in 2014, I started to get a sense of who is engaged in the province or the city of Winnipeg on human rights issues. And that allowed me, and one of the people that I met was a young woman who was at the University of Winnipeg who had started a human rights hub. It was a kind of a calendar. Her name was Christy McLeod, and she was trying to find out how we could engage more people with events happening in Winnipeg. And she graduated. I got to know her, and I took over the Human Rights Hub just as COVID hit. And it was at that point that I was fortunate enough to be introduced to you and start a podcast called Humans on Rights. And I thoroughly enjoy the opportunity to, it's not my show, and I think you've been a great mentor for me, by the way, on that, Matt. You've been very helpful in giving me a sense to understand how you can try to make the program as positive as possible, but by allowing people, just as you're doing here with me, by the way, allowing people to sort of tell their own stories. So I love the idea of engaging people, experts, educators on issues. Because, I learn, and I'm just hopeful that the audience that's listening, that's engaged, learns. And it's a chance for us to feel, I think, pretty positive about how passionate we are in the city of Winnipeg about human rights and making the life better for people as best as we can, knowing that there's a lot of challenges.
You could make a case for Winnipeg becoming a world capital, or a hub, as you like to call it, for human rights.
Yeah, so Matt, that is a goal of mine, to work with people. I really think that we need to establish an international human rights award here in Winnipeg, one that is on the same size as the Pulitzer Peace Prize. I mean, I think we need to really dream big. Izzy Asper gave us an amazing opportunity when he was another big dreamer like Mulroney, when he brought the Canadian Museum for Human Rights to Winnipeg, where everybody said, why Winnipeg? He fought for it. We have it. I think one of the things that would help us to further the conversation about making Winnipeg that international human rights education city is to establish an international award here of magnitude and let people put their eyes on Winnipeg and understand why is that award here, what's the history, and of course I think that the start of it would be through the Canadian Museum for Human Rights.
You know, if you proposed this 15 years ago and you said to me Winnipeg should be the capital for this, I would probably say, well, why? And then wonder. But now here we are 15 years into the future. And I said, yeah, it totally makes sense. You look at the French and the English and the indigenous populations that have been here. Winnipeg was the gateway for Ukrainians and Jewish and everybody who's come to shape all the parts of Canada. So, yeah, makes sense to me.
Yeah, and Matt, you bring up some of the great history, and I think that it was Art Morrow that gave a speech once to the Winnipeg Jewish Foundation, and he talked about why not Winnipeg when you talk about the Geneva of the Prairies. I mean, you know, we've got such great history, and at that point, of course, he was starting the Morrow Centre for Peace and Justice. The Canadian Museum for Human Rights was coming out of the ground. You know, Lloyd Axworthy was doing something at the University of Winnipeg around human rights. University of Manitoba was active. So, you know, I think what he was trying to say is just what you just hit on, and that is, look at our history. Look how we've been able to sort of solve this working together. How do we now not establish what the next steps are, and that is to make Winnipeg an international human rights education city?
Well, continued success on the podcast. I love to keep counting. I do my best, but I think you're 70 plus episodes into the show that started in the pandemic. And here we are 2024, and we are chugging along nicely, and lots more guests, and it comes out every 2 weeks, of course.
Yeah, no, and listen, again, thank you, Matt, for all the great work that you do. And yes, last issue was 74, episode 74, with Chef Rob Thomas, who you know, talking on Black History Month about the importance of what food has to do with culture, and was a great program. Again, not because of the host, but because of the people that were on.
Thanks so much for talking today, Stuart. I appreciate it.
Matt, as always, thanks for everything you do. Much appreciated.
Thanks for listening to You May Also Like. You may also like our website at youmayalsolike.net. The show is produced by Evan Serminski and built for your ears by everyone at the Sound Off Media Company.